When it comes to sight reading, there's a lot of discussion about what to do with your eyes while you're playing. But have you considered what's going on with your hands? We're going to discuss that next. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 62. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. If you're one of my younger listeners out there, one of the fun things you might discover as you get an adult is that allergies are something that you can develop as an adult, even when you did not have them when you were younger. I'm pretty sure I got to be 30 or older with no trace of an allergy of any kind. And I don't know what I'm allergic to, but apparently I have allergies all the time now. So this week has not been one of the better ones. And so if my voice sounds a little more bass-like, a little more lurch-like, that's what's going on today. So it wasn't that bad during the interview that I'm going to share. So it's just this introduction. I sound like it's early in the morning, which it actually is, but it's compounded by just some allergies going on. Anyway, I hope all of you are doing well this week. I'm really looking forward to sharing today's episode. We're going to be discussing a topic that I'm really surprised it's only the second time that we've explored it, and it's been almost a full year since I previously explored it with a guest, and that is the concept of sight reading. Before the Musician Toolkit, I had a podcast called Life in the Pit, all about theater musicians. And one of the things that gave me the idea for this one is I would occasionally ask what aspects of musicianship helped them to succeed at a high level in their jobs, especially when I'm talking to those who have been on Broadway tours, people who've actually sat in Broadway, so people who have done that at the highest professional level. And the number one thing that was always mentioned was good sight reading skills. And I found that to be the case even in a more local, more regional level. Being able to sight read well has done a lot of things for me. It does a lot of things for me every week. I have a part-time church job where I play piano. I play on Wednesday nights. I play on Sunday mornings. And there's a time earlier in my musical life where I would have had to have practiced everything in advance before going to rehearsal or before going to the Sunday morning service or whatever service it is. And I've been there for more than a year. I haven't had to practice hardly anything yet. Like there's maybe been like a page full of measures of all the pages that I've played that I've had to actually practice. Everything else I have been able to sight read at performance level. Now, to be fair, the church I play for is not doing the hardest repertoire out there as far as piano accompaniments go. So it could be much harder than it is. But I have earned myself kind of a relaxing position because I have put in the effort to develop my sight reading skills. And as I mentioned before, and as I'll mention again in this interview, I am not a naturally good sight reader. I worked really hard to develop this aspect of my musicianship, to develop this tool. One type of gig that I have done quite a bit of is playing for theater auditions, which this is when several aspiring actors, several actors who want to be in a particular play, or sometimes it's mega audition, so they're auditioning for possible a role or two or three in multiple musicals or multiple plays. They'll bring in sheet music that I've never seen, and I need to play it well enough that if they don't get the role, nobody's going to think it was because of the pianist. So no pressure. I mean, but I can go on and on. If you could sight read well, you could be asked to play for a dinner party and just bring a whole bunch of music and just open it, and someone could request something, and as long as they're not requesting something, that's like truly sophisticated, you could just find that music, or, sorry, I was giving more of a pre-2024 example, you could take your iPad and you could go online to IMSLP or Music Notes or somewhere where you can obtain the sheet music fairly quickly, and whatever it is, however you're getting your sheet music, you can on the spot play it and know that it's going to be pretty well. Sight reading is an immensely useful tool. When we talked about it before, we talked about mindset of sight reading. So that was back on episode 11, which was called Sight Reading Maverick with Erica Sipes. We talked about a lot of great things on an episode, and that was, again, almost a year ago. It was March 6th, 2023 that we had that episode. And mostly we talked about the mindset of sight reading. We talked a little bit about tactical aspects of sight reading, such as where do the eyes go and kind of having more of a relaxed stare. If you're not a vocalist, though, there's a good chance that while you're sight reading, your hands are doing something to play your instrument. And that is the main topic of today's conversation that I'm having with David Holter. David Holter is a friend and a local colleague who several years ago decided to specialize in teaching sight reading. And he started a group on Facebook that I'm going to mention that when I got on there, it was, just a couple of dozen members, and now has more than 11,000 members. And it's all about piano sight reading. So we're talking from the aspect of sight reading at the piano, and his course is for pianists who want to develop better at sight reading. But no matter what instrument you play, I'm sure you can translate this advice to your hands as well. But also, piano skills is one of the core tools of musicianship, no matter what your primary instrument is. So everybody can make use of the things that we're talking about this episode. But what we're going to be getting into today, again, is thinking about what are the hands doing. Because if you're supposed to keep your eyes on the page and you're supposed to keep looking ahead by a measure or two, or ahead of where you're playing, you can't be looking down at your hands. So your hands have to be aware of what's going on. So we're going to get into that. And I really love this conversation and love David's take on this. This is something that I have thought about on my own before, which is really kind of a gap in how sight reading is taught. And David has addressed it, and he's addressed it with a course, he's addressed it with a group. A lot of thoughts on the subject. So here is my interview with David Holter. So today, I think for the first time ever, I'm talking to someone with the same name as me. I'm talking to David. So, but David Holter, great to have you on the podcast today.
So happy to be here. Thank you, David.
I mean, not only am I talking to someone with the same first name, but it's also a piano teacher. But we very briefly were neighbors in a studio for maybe a portion of a year. I think about half of 2019 we were neighbors, and then the pandemic happened, and that store moved, and we don't have teaching studios there. But anyways, it's good to reconnect with you again. So how have you been doing lately?
I'm doing well. I've been transitioning recently into teaching, especially sight reading and also piano technique, and how those two go together. So we work on them separately, and then we'll work on them together. And I've also been transitioning into teaching more, as a lot of us have the past few years, teaching more virtually, online.
Yeah.
And recently also teaching groups, small groups, which I really enjoy. It's a lot of fun.
So this episode's all about the how-to of sight reading, and I'll get into that in a moment. But if I understand your story correctly, like you are not a natural sight reader, which probably means why you're a passionate teacher. Like I cannot teach ear training because I've always done it well. I mean, I shouldn't say I can't teach it.
Yeah.
I'm teaching by rote. I'm basically, here's what people say you should be listening for. I've never struggled with ear training, so it's not, it's not something that I'm passionate about. Whereas The things that, like music theory, I actually am. I am pretty good at music theory, but I didn't really get into it until I got to college, where I really kind of dived in. So I think it's just things that you discover, as a student, especially like later in your music journey, that become passions. So I take it sight reading was that for you?
Absolutely. So I know what you mean about certain things coming more naturally, and you've kind of always done them well. So you don't necessarily remember the process of going from, disaster to master with a certain topic. And maybe similar to what you discovered and learned to love about music theory, I can very easily remember a kind of turning point where I went from avoiding sight reading, for the first 10 years of my piano studies and trying to play, a Christmas gig when I was a teenager, and basically pretending almost to read, a bunch of Christmas carols that I had spent over 20 hours that week, like painstakingly working out, and then someone said, well, hey, you haven't played my favorite Christmas carol yet. Can you play Silent Night? And I really kind of in a panic flipped in my book to Silent Night, but I could barely get started. And some of the people gathered around wanted to sing along, and they were confused. Why were you able to, quote unquote, read all these other Christmas carols, and now you can't read, one of the simplest, slowest Christmas carols of all, and also most popular, right? So that was when I realized, or I started to think that I'm just not a sight reader. It was embarrassing. I kind of played it by ear the best I could. But I remember that very well. And so for several years after that, I had this kind of wish, I was jealous of my friends that could sight read really well. It seemed to be naturals. But I didn't really know how to go about it. And because I felt like I just wasn't, born a sight reader, I avoided practicing sight reading. I didn't really get better until Dr. Barbara Lister-Sink's sight reading class at Salem College was a turning point for me. So similar for what you described with music theory, I dove into sight reading in her sight reading class because there was a moment where I realized, hey, maybe I've just been going about it the wrong way. Maybe I can learn to do this. And that moment was when she has several barber's bibs, like you wear to get a haircut, hanging up in her piano studio. And I always kind of wondered, what are those there for? Like, does she get, her haircut here or what? But during the sight reading class, she wrapped me up in one of those barber's bibs, and she draped the barber's bib over the piano keys. And then she put up a really simple minuet, on the piano rack, and she asked me to sight read it. And immediately I realized that I can't even get started with sight reading without looking down at my hands, And I had heard before, well, if you want to develop as a sight reader, you shouldn't look down, and you also shouldn't stop. You should just go and go and go and read and read and read. And when I tried to do those two things simultaneously, I just felt completely lost and hopeless, because it's kind of like if you tell someone, for example, if I invited you over to my house and took you down into the garage where there's just a bunch of stuff lying around, and it was night and we didn't turn on the lights, and I said, David, I want you to run through this garage fast and don't stop. You would move really like hesitantly and kind of start, and you might get hurt. It would be a really uncomfortable experience. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of like what we're asking our students to do when we say, don't look down, don't stop. You're basically having to run your fingers all over the place to play all the right targets, to go where you want them to go, but you can't even see where you're going.
Right.
So that experience got me on this journey of realizing that I've got to learn to develop my feel for the keys so that I can become a better sight reader. Because when I studied with her, I already had a degree in music composition from Middlebury College. I'd already studied piano for a long time and played, Beethoven sonatas, etc. But I couldn't sight read the simplest thing because the moment I began to sight read, my initial response was to look down to find the target, and then to look up, and then to look down again to find the next target. And I'd studied with really good teachers. I just avoided practicing sight reading because I was missing that particular skill. in my practice routine, of feeling the keys.
Right. In spite of the fact that this is a general music podcast, piano skills is one of the basic tools, and so many of us also have instruments that we can kind of translate this to, whether it be like, fingerings on a woodwind or brass, or, where the left hand is on a string instrument. Piano, is one of those instruments kind of like harp or organ or yeah, I tell you who really impresses me are mallet percussion instruments, because they're not even touching their instrument. They're holding on to sticks, and it's like, and they have to sight read while finding that. But so whatever your instrument is, you probably had a teacher tell you to sight read well, keep your eyes on the sheet music. And I did that for a while. And I'll say that there are common elements in our story, in that it was an embarrassing situation that opened our eyes that we needed to get better at sight reading. For me, it was showing up in my first voice lesson as a college accompanist, because I went to a college where they put students on scholarship for accompanying hours. They didn't have they actually did have a designated accompanist, but he couldn't do all the work, so the students kind of took up the slack. And I was like, okay, well, I can do that. I figured I'd be going in week 1 while the students is learning their part, and I can learn my part. But that's not how it works. You come in on week 4 when they've been working on it, and it's already up to tempo. And it's like, and here's a show tune from a Broadway musical. Just play it, David. And it was thankfully I had heard it before, so I was able to fake it by ear while realizing I'm probably not doing it exactly right. And I had to take a special course on sight reading while I was there. And then, my project was over the course of a summer, I just went through the entire book 1 and book 2 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Just took an entire summer, because most of it was new. I'd only learned like 3 of the preludes and 2 of the fugues, so I was pretty good to go as far as that goes. But one of the things that I think maybe not as common is, as long as I can remember, I've always had a feel of the keys, and that was because, just for fun, speaking of that dark garage, I used to let my parents turn out the light in the living room, and they would go to the bed, and they have a little door to the hallway, so that, like, if I decided to practice at night, it wouldn't interfere with their sleep or anything like that. But I just decided not to turn the lights back on. I would just play at the piano in the dark, use my ear, and kind of unintentionally starting to learn the feel of the keys. But I still never took advantage of the fact that, or understood that I don't have to look at my hands. So I got that part out of the way. But when I started teaching and basically parroting the advice that I'd been told, or teaching, what I had learned of what your eyes should be doing, I realized I had not been teaching, what should your hands be feeling for? What is going on with your hands so you don't have to look? So, let's just talk about some kinesthetic awareness of the keys. What are some ways, we all have ways that we teach the letters when you look at them. What are some ways that you get some key awareness without looking at it? What are some ways that you found to be successful?
One of the best starting points, I would say, is what I call the basic feel exercise. So a lot of these are just kind of, they've evolved from, years of working on this with students, when I realized how much developing my own feel for the keys benefited my sight reading. I wanted to then, give this to my students and give them very clear kind of step-by-step exercises. And the basic feel exercise, so if anybody listening is at their piano, or if you play another instrument, you could absolutely tweak this for your instrument. I grew up playing the violin, and I remember how challenging it was the moment those little stickers were removed, for where I had to place my fingers. But I also played clarinet, and I played saxophone later. And I love clarinet and saxophone because the hands don't have to jump around. Mm-hmm. The primary challenge with piano, of course, with any mallet instrument, organ, quite a few instruments, where we do need to develop this kinesthetic awareness is because we're constantly jumping around. For piano, one hand has to jump maybe a fifth while the other hand's jumping 2 octaves. So it's quite a skill. But the very kind of beginning point of working on this that I found with my students to be pretty helpful to just kind of jumpstart thinking about this and feeling the keys with awareness is the basic feel exercise. So all you do is you sit at your keyboard and you close your eyes and you reach out and you land your hand inside the black keys, so that all 5 fingertips are feeling black keys. And you want your hand in a 5th hand span. So with some students, they already know what a 5th hand span kind of feels like, right? Because it's the most natural, intuitive, and most beginning piano pieces are in that 5th hand span where you've got a 5th from thumb to pinky. If that's not, even that, it can be bizarre for some students to try to land their hand in a 5th inside the black keys without looking. So sometimes we'll look first and just get a feel for that, going from our lap to the keys back and forth, But then once they have a good feel for the 5th hand span, they can land the hand in there and just notice what each finger is feeling, right? So we start very simply at first, especially if the student has never done this sort of thing before. So now that I have my hand inside the black keys in the 5th hand span, my first question is, what is my thumb feeling? Is my thumb between 2 black keys, or is it in a white key pocket, we call it, or like a white key gap with 2 white keys in a row? And then you go through each finger and you just ask yourself that question, and then based on the sum total of what you're feeling, you think to yourself, or you say out loud to your teacher, what hand position you're in, named by the bottom note. Or as I'll usually say, instead of G position, we call it G to D position, because that way we're getting a really clear sense of, the territory that the hand is covering. And the 5th hand span is a really great place to start because it's so natural, but also because there's no gap in what we're feeling. The moment we go to a 6th hand span or 7th or certainly an octave, there are gaps in parts of the keyboard that we're unable to feel, So the 5th hand span is like this unbroken beam of awareness. For example, if I have my thumb on G and my pinky on D, and I've got all 5 fingers inside the black keys, I can literally feel from F sharp to E flat. I can feel 10 of the 12 keys.
Yeah.
So it's a really good starting point.
Yeah. And, this is actually something I think if you play organ, you've known this since the beginning, because you know that you've got sheet music and you've got 2 hands, possibly 2 or more manuals, and you've got foot pedals. And so when it comes to those foot pedals, they tell you ballet shoes or take off your shoes so that you can feel around down there where those right. Basically the equivalent of the 2 and the 3 black keys are, so you can find your way around, and you're supposed to use your heel and toe strategically to kind of, smoothly find your way, across. So we're just moving that to the hands where we sometimes neglect that. Thinking about the 5 finger positions, I don't think, I'm kind of comparing method books. I'm not gonna call out like what teachers do, but what method books encourage. It's basically CDE, FGAB. We learn them in those groups. Right. One thing that I think Faber does really well. It's actually a theory exercise, but it's a good practical exercise. It's in their primer book, and they basically, you fill out going from A to A and then B to B and C to C. And I said, okay, good, do that. Now say it out loud while you go up and down. But you could also do that with any 5 notes in a row, just A, B, C, D, E, E, D, C, B, A, B, C, D, E, F, F, E, D, C, B, and just kind of go through like that. And maybe do that while you're not looking and finding those on the piano. That could be a good example. I've also found kind of, there's the name that key game, but it's where I might also say, I might take the student's hand and put it in a zone, and I said, okay, now don't look, find me a G. So so he's right. They're thinking, all right, find the three black keys, F, G, A, B. There's the G.
Exactly.
Right. We'll just call this the kinesthetic awareness of keys. I've said often before, there's three senses we use in music. I think using your hearing, your listening, kind of almost goes without saying. I think that doesn't surprise anybody. And then we can really get into, like, when we talk about vision, of course, that's two places. That's what's happening. If you look at your hands, that's what's happening on the sheet music. So that's what your eyes do is also very important. But I really think the most powerful way to really get a kind of a mastery of the instrument is, what's happening with the feel. And by the way, I meant to say, I like what you said earlier, from disaster to master. I like that better than from mystery to mastery.
I like mystery to mastery too, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I like that disaster to master. That's a nice contrast. Let's go to some specifics though. Let's talk about so if you're learning some scales, you're learning some chords, like what are some exercises you might do to kind of get used to not having to watch your hands and get familiar with that?
Totally. So you just mentioned the three, senses that we really use as musicians. The hearing and the visual when we're reading music, of course, or when we're looking over at the conductor or other musicians, etc., or when we're looking down at our hands. Mm-hmm. And the kinesthetic or the tactile, the feel for the keys, And so I think it's best to work on one at a time. Mm-hmm. So I do have my students practice scales and chords, arpeggios, any sort of technique that they're trying to develop, first by looking down. Because, like we were talking about running through the dark room, it helps first to turn the lights on and just see where you're going. Mm-hmm. So I encourage them first to work on any new technique, actually looking, so that they can move, right? Because when we're working on technique, the most important thing is getting that ease and that fluidity to the movement. And that comes much more easily when you can look at the targets. Just like when I was on violin as a beginner and had the stickers, showing me where to put my fingers. Then once you have a good feel for it, it doesn't take long. And sometimes within the same practice session, I'll show them, here's, an E major arpeggio. And once they get the feel for it, then I'll just have them close their eyes and do it again. So now instantly, in the brain, there's less activity in the visual cortex, which otherwise can really overwhelm the other senses. The eyes can really take over. And now there's actually not only more attention and awareness in the feel of the keys, but also in the way they're using the body, the way they're using the arm. And it's easier to listen. So I used to play in the dark too as a kid and just kind of make things up and improvise. And I loved it because I think the ears are a little bit more, they wake up a little more easily when we're not looking at something. We're really just putting our attention on the feel and the sound. So I think it's fantastic. But first we start by looking so that we can really develop the technique and see how we're doing it, and see the targets and gain that ease and fluidity to the movement.
Yeah, you hit on kind of a basic of practice, and I feel like I could just do like a mini episode on this, but what you pay attention to is what gets improved, and if you try to like pay attention to everything, you're diluting your attention. But if you say, I'm going to focus on what my thumb is doing right now in the right hand, that's going to get improved. Whereas if I'm trying to pay attention to both hands at once and the rhythm and the dynamics and the articulation and and the pedaling,
right.
So taking one thing at a time, even as specific as that, that's such a good tip, just for practicing.
Totally. And it goes back to your previous podcast episode where you talked about slow practice, and I think that's so valuable to have one thing at a time that you're really focusing on. And so I think in the slow practice episode, you mentioned that it can be helpful to practice something up to speed as long as it's in a very small amount, right? It's just like maybe half a measure or one measure.
Right.
And so I do that with my students too, to help them gain confidence that they really can feel their way around the keys. Of course, I emphasize that there's nothing wrong with glancing down. We all need to glance down sometimes when we're sight reading. It's great. It's fine. But the more we develop our feel for the keys, the more that glancing down is a way of kind of confirming what we're already pretty confident that we can leap to. So whenever a student, has to shift hand positions and just kind of automatically glances down as a habitual thing, then we'll just go back and we'll practice like you recommended. First, actually pretty slowly, just feeling that movement and actually looking down at the hand and getting a feel for that exact movement. Then looking back up at where that movement happens in the sheet music. And now, instead of the eyes closed, now we're looking at that hand position shift in the sheet music and still feeling it and just doing reps, first slowly, but then up to tempo. And like you recommended too, I don't recommend that students kind of notch up the metronome bit by bit for something like that.
Yeah.
We alternate between going nice and slow, taking our time, and then just going for it pretty quickly.
Right.
And that really developed.
I didn't say this at the time, but really what you're doing to improve when you're increasing the speed. So this is what I called pause, play, practice. And
right.
I don't think I was clear on that. To say that the pause time can be as long as you need. If you need to wait 10, 15, 20 seconds before you move, that's fine. So the way you speed up the piece is you speed up the decision time. You get to where, I can think about this for 5 seconds and then move. And I can think about it for 3 and then 2 seconds. And then I only need 1 second, before I'm moving. And then before you know it, you're very close up to tempo. And I do believe, you mentioned you studied with Barbara Lister-Sink. I've seen her videos before, and in past videos, she's kind of, said, really the only type of practice she recommends for the most part, once you have kind of the basic technique that she teaches is, I don't know if she called them clusters or clumps, or something like that, but basically like here's 2 notes or here's, but she kind of recommended like logical phrases when you're working on music, like let's
right.
take this little motive or this thing, but up to speed and then do it again and do it again. But rather than like one note, next note, next.
Exactly. I think you referenced, leaping maybe an octave or several octaves. And then if you were to practice that in slow motion, that is helpful. I think because it helps to get a really nice feel for that leap. But like you recommended, then if you just go for it up to speed, like you really go maybe even faster than you need to for the piece, then you're developing your technique in the same way that a gymnast or any athlete has to practice things up to speed, right? So like a gymnast who's running and does a twirl and a flip and lands it, they can't practice that in slow motion. They have to repeat that pretty advanced, motor skill again and again and again, and just tweak something each time, put their attention on something that they want to shift each time. So we do the same thing at the piano, which is just a much smaller, dance floor or gymnasium floor, but it's the same principles for developing a motor coordination. Absolutely. And a lot of what I teach is definitely inspired and adapted or absolutely stolen from Dr. Barbara Lister-Sink.
Right. Do you ever find yourself like encouraging temporarily to do something technique-wise, to learn something that, maybe you wouldn't want them to keep doing? Like, I'll give a good example just for myself. And I always wonder like how much I should pass this along to my students, but to learn all of my chords and inversions really well, what I would do is I would play the chord, flex the fingers pretty tight, and then pull it up so that I can really feel that distance, and then put it right back down. And I would do the same thing with a first inversion. Like normally, we don't want students to squeeze the hand really tight. We want, like Alfred's piano library always said, pretend you have a bubble in your hand and you don't want it to break. You're just putting enough pressure to hold on to the bubble, which, I think is generally pretty good. But when it comes to like, I'm trying to tell my brain what this chord feels like. So I'm intentionally squeezing that to kind of the same way that if I'm working on a wrist rotation, I'm exaggerating it, So like, do you ever use any exaggeration or any extra tension in your exercises to learn certain things?
I recommend that students, let's say I need them to develop just the feel of the first inversion chord, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I tend to do is just have them go from the lap back to the keys, back and forth, back and forth. And with a lot of them, we've worked so hard on eliminating any unnecessary tension that I have them do it as freely as they can. For some students, being more physically engaged with it in that kind of way might be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it depends on the student, but a lot of them they're working so hard on releasing unnecessary tension that I have them go back and forth from the lap and then, open up the hand to that particular hand span. So first inversion, that would be a sixth, right? As freely as they can. And that way they learn to trust that they can feel for that hand span, that hand shape. And it'll be nice and free. The key with all of this, though, I think, is repetition, of course. So the challenge with sight reading, is that you may have a passage where there are 7 or 8 different chord shapes, right? And so any student that hasn't mastered each of those chord shapes individually somehow is going to struggle, and that flow is gonna stop, or they're gonna get really tense, when they arrive at that particular shape that they're not as familiar with. So that's why I'll just have them look at a chord shape that's not even on the staff. It's just the shape of that chord on like a 3-line staff, for example, so that it's not note specific, and just have them play that shape in various positions on the keys, often inside the black keys. And we work on releasing tension in the hand even when you're inside the black keys, because that can be pretty challenging for students sometimes, and for all of us, to have that hand nice and free inside the black keys. But yeah, I think there's a place for having more tension in the hand, if that'll help the student to really download the feel of that hand shape. But then I would right away tell them also, now let's go back to a free hand, as much as possible.
Right. So let's get to now the question that everyone always asks when it comes to whether it's sight reading or just playing. That's putting hands together, especially when the hands are not doing the same things, like maybe different rhythm. Now, we have graded repertoire for that, where like one, I think most like method books, the hands go together and one hand's not doing too much, or they're doing very similar things, and we gradually ask it to do more. But what are just some thoughts that you have when it comes to especially trying to sight read music when the hands are doing different things, especially as you mentioned, like they might leap at different intervals, like one leaps at a fifth, the other one leaps at an octave.
Right. So I'll go over briefly the 5 core skills that are kind of the foundation of how I teach this. And then I'll try to explain how those core skills are worked on first hands separately and then hands together. Because music is so complex, as you alluded to earlier, that one of our jobs as teachers and as professional musicians when we're practicing is to break this complex skill down and just focus on one sub-skill at a time, And so for me, Dr. Listersink broke down the skill of sight reading, and one of the sub-skills was, hey, you gotta be able to sight read quite a bit just by feeling the keys instead of looking down. So then, because I became a little obsessed with that sub-skill, I broke that down into 5 sub-skills that we call the core skills, and they spell the word SPARK, S-P-A-R-K, just a helpful way to remember the 5 core skills. So I'll go through each one and talk about how that can also ultimately help with hands together, because that is one of the most common challenges that people cite when it comes to sight reading. It's like, yeah, I can read the bass clef just fine, especially for pianists, and I can read the treble clef just fine. But when you ask me to do them both at once, I mean, come on, right? It's really complex. So the first letter S, that stands for shapes. Like we were just talking about, chord shapes, for example. A student might be really pretty good at just sight reading as long as it's simple triads, root position, first inversion, second inversion, and maybe they can do that in both hands. But the moment they get to a more complex chord in the left hand, and simultaneously a more complex chord in the right hand, or what we call a kind of a melodic shape, where it's a broken chord, that can easily throw them off. So at that point, I would stop and just extract that shape, that chord shape that caused them to stop or that they missed. And we would just drill that shape left and right all over the keyboard, hands separately at first, and then hands together as they're looking at that chord shape, just the extracted image of it. So now they're getting a chance, because music flies by so fast. Now they're actually getting a chance to deepen the feel for that particular shape, first with one hand, then with the other hand, and then hands together. Then we'll do the same thing with whatever the challenge was in the right hand, but we'll also have left hand work on that particular shape, So that's generally the process, is first, let's extract the exact skill in terms of recognition and feeling the keys, and then we'll work on it hands separately and then hands together, right? So the first letter stands for shapes, and that's typically how I'll work on it. The second letter stands for positions, right? So positions is simply like we all talk about as pianists and teachers. We got C position, D position, E position. So it's really useful if a student struggles, to recognize, for example, diminished seventh, just kind of root position, that chord shape, to practice that in different positions on the keyboard. So the shapes and positions go together. And then the A is for anchors. This seems to be a lot of people's favorite, including my father, who has played his whole life, and he has studied some of this. And he says, David, I kind of knew most of this stuff, and I was kind of using it already, but recently I've been using anchors more. So he's played a lot most of his life, and he accompanies a lot of students at East Carolina University, and he has to learn music pretty quickly often. And he actually, in Fourscore, he created his own custom stamp that looks like an anchor, and so he'll just poke the screen left and right anywhere next to a note that he wants to use as a specific anchor. So this is one of those skills that will be familiar to pianists, but it helps to put a name to it. It's similar to finger substitution, right? Where you have a particular note and you're switching fingers on that note in order to facilitate a very direct and intentional hand position shift. But I'll have students work on anchors in isolation. An anchor is basically any note or finger that you pay extra attention to, and then you orient your movement around that. So a really simple anchor exercise, just to help get comfortable, shifting positions on the keys, is to play the same note. This is kind of the most basic anchors exercise. Just play the same note with each finger, right? So you play D, for example, with 3, and then with 2, and then with 1, and then back to 2. So now you're practicing position shifts by step using the D as an anchor. And then we'll shift to position shifts by skip. So we play that D with 3, and then with 1, and then with 3, and then with 5, and so on until we get to what are called close anchors. For example, if I've got my thumb on C and I want to move, I'm trying to follow the fingering in the sheet music, and it says, hey, you got to put, your fourth finger down on the A below the C. Well, my thumb is like a close anchor because it's the closest to the target. So I use the feel of where that thumb is to then toss my hand down about to where I think I would land 4 on A. So that gets a little more advanced,
Right.
But we practice those in isolation using anchors. And that can also be very helpful in learning repertoire, to just get really clear on when I get to this moment in the sheet music, I'm going to put all my attention on this particular finger to prepare me to then make this move, and then the R in Spark stands for regions. So, this is one of my own peculiar strategies. Is I love to sit centered with middle D. A lot of people sit centered with middle C, which makes sense, in terms of music theory. The instrument is certainly based around C, but in terms of the topography of the keyboard, if we sit centered with middle D, then I can easily reach out for one thing and find that middle D, those two black keys, by basically reaching out straight in front of my belly button, without looking down. Mm-hmm. So that orients me really well. But then the beauty of sitting centered with middle D is that I've got the groups of 2 black keys and the groups of 3 black keys are all symmetrical with my body. So I can reach out and land my hand on or close to any group of 3 black keys, for example. And then if I reach out the same angle on the other side of my body with the other arm, I'll land pretty close to that group of 3 black keys on the other side. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's getting into the regions of the keyboard. And then lastly, the K kind of ties the others together. So the K is know, K-N-O-W. And that's when we can look at sheet music and know how it'll feel to play in the hands. And of course, once again, we start these anchors and regions exercises first with one hand and just get really comfortable with the exercise that way. And then the other hand, and then we go for hands together, taking our time without this metronome clicking away at first. So we can really just take our time to feel those skills hands together. And also without the musical payoff, without the musical kick at first, without the musical enjoyment that actually is, one of the complexities that we're dealing with when we're really sight reading is having to get across an emotional musical expression. That's all set aside as we work on these core skills to give ourselves the chance, to really develop them and then to integrate them into our sight reading.
Right. I think a quality, that I guess a tool of musicianship that hasn't really gotten brought up before, for this type of approach is really patience, and that is, because everybody just wants to, when am I going to learn this song? I love the question I've gotten from all kinds of ages before, even maybe an adult student or two. It's like, when am I going to be able to actually play the piano? When am I going to be able to know it? And I keep, I have to say, there is a lot of literature out there that I could not play with any degree of ease. It would take me. I mean, there are pieces written that I would say, if I committed to 2 or 3 years of practicing, I could probably get there. So it's like there's not this. Now I've made it, I can play everything. I said, as you improve, there will be less music in the world that you can't play. But
right, that's a good way to put it.
And maybe I guess you could say there's less. Yeah, there's more music in the world that you can play if you want to think about it like that. But
totally.
But the types of technique exercises and just awareness, these exercises, I guess it takes a little bit of explanation, especially the younger students. Look, you're postponing your enjoyment of what you're playing, but you're developing tools that will allow you to really right away play more sophisticated music and enjoy it.
Right. That's really well put. And along those lines, we can, as teachers, we can make these sort of exercises fun. I mean, that's part of our job, right, is to make them engaging. Mm-hmm. So I do my best. Once a student, for example, one of the regions exercises is just playing third finger on all the different Ds, leaping around. So that's good for octave leaps. And then once they get comfortable with that, going at their own pace, I'll have them kind of improvise, various things where they're leaping and they're just playing Ds, where they do have a steady beat. They're not looking down, but they're making up their own piece. And then I have visual, quote unquote, pieces that just use the Ds, for example. So now they're practicing leaping around. And I try to make those kind of rhythmic and fun, So there are ways that we can do our best to make these exercises that are not, they're not Mozart, they're not Beethoven, they're not, anything musically compelling. We can try to make them kind of fun in a percussive way, since the piano is percussive. But I think that goes for any instrument also.
Right. So you talked about Spark, and that's a natural lead into a couple of tools that you have offered over the last few years, and one of them is you do have a course called sightreadingspark.com is the website, sightreadingspark.com. So maybe just talk briefly about that course, and of course I'll put the website in the show notes, but just tell us about your Sight Reading Spark course.
Sure. So, ever since I started working on developing my feel for the keys myself, I took a lot of notes on what worked, what didn't. And I guess that was about 10 years ago or so now, when I started really working on this for myself. And then after several years of sort of experimentation and trial and error, I started then offering exercises to my students. And it's like you talk about, David, the Pareto principle, right? So I just tried a bunch of things myself, and I also used exercises from Dr. Barbara Lister-Singh's class, which worked really well. And I found, the 20% that made the 80% of the difference, and I started then giving those to my students and tweaking further. And then, when COVID struck and everything went virtual for me as a teacher, I wanted to keep working with students on these skills, but I found that, online, when we only met a half an hour once a week, we really had to cut to the chase and work on their pieces, work on their technique. There wasn't a lot of extra time for trying things out, so to speak. So I offered all through 2021 a weekly class, just complimentary to my students. I said, hey, I'm trying things out, and so I just gave them a lot of kind of crazy, different sorts of exercises for developing their feel for the keys and tried to make it fun. And then ended up just making a lot of videos as well to send to them. And eventually I realized that I should, again, just take the 20% of all that stuff that really seems to work well for people and turn it into a kind of course, because just like Dr. Lister-Singh did for me with technique, I love really breaking things down so that the student can go step by step by step. So that's where the Sight Reading Spark course came from, was here are the exercises that seem to really make a difference. And the general principle is that, in the Sight Reading Spark course, I have you first practice a certain skill looking down, like we talked about, so you can really move confidently and accurately. Then I'll show some very simple imagery, not even sheet music necessarily, because even if you just look at a blank piece of sheet music, you've already got 5 lines treble clef, 5 lines bass clef. It's already fairly complex. So the imagery is simply showing you exactly what to feel for and how to move. And then that eventually kind of evolves back into, traditional sheet music notation as you're developing your feel for the keys. And so that's generally the Sight Reading Spark course. It's I think it's around 8 hours, video training and games. So it alternates training with a game, right? Because games are a great way to learn. So, for example, just reaching out and playing certain Ds, like I was referring to, turns into a kind of little video game of sorts, nice. At the keyboard.
Great. So that's sightreadingspark.com. And then the other resource that you have, if you're on Facebook, there's a group called Piano Sight Reading Community. And I'm pretty sure that when I got on, being a local colleague, I think there was about 30 or 40 members. And last check as of yesterday, there's 11.1 thousand members of that group, so it has really grown in popularity. So you're obviously touching a subject that appeals to a lot of people. So, yeah, I would just encourage anybody to go check that out. Notifications are weird, so I don't know how much recent information there is on there, but people do chime in, and I guess, they ask questions, and we haven't really talked about this. This is something that a lot of people ask: what materials can I use for sight reading? And I think if you join that group, you could just go type that in. But are there favorite materials that you find for just working on sight reading repertoire?
Yes. So, well, two answers to this. One resource that I recommend to everyone is Hannah Smith's Progressive Sight Reading Exercises for the Piano. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty old book. I think it's around $10 on Amazon. It's bright green. And I love this book because she wrote hundreds of one-line exercises that are gradually increasing in complexity. And she goes through various time signatures, all the key signatures. The rhythms also increase in complexity. But the reason I like this book in particular is because all these exercises have both hands in the same hand position. So that may sound like maybe a little too simple, but it really gives students the chance to develop a feel for all these different hand positions, like we've talked about. So here's what the A flat position feels like. Or, sorry, they're not always in the same hand position. Most of them are. And then she does have, one hand in A flat, the thumb on A flat, one hand with, pinky on E flat in the left hand, etc. But they're always in the fifth hand span. So the student gets a really good feel for this, all critical fifth hand span in all the various positions, in all the different keys on the piano. Mm-hmm. And then my second answer to the question about, what resources are good for sight reading scores is any score, any piece is a really great tool for developing your feel for the keys if you go about it using what we call blue mode. And again, that's just a term that evolved from working on this with students. And it's similar to what David described in his last podcast about slow practice. If you take any score, even, something that looks really complex, if you actually practice it in blue mode, which means that you can't look down ever, just for right now, because you're specifically targeting developing your feel for the keys, but you also can stop. So it's not like don't look down and don't stop, the kind of traditional sight reading advice. It's don't look down, but do stop, on every note. So it doesn't matter so much how advanced the music is. Your job is to feel, take your time to feel for the very first beat, right? Take all the time you need. And then when you're pretty sure you've got it by feel, go ahead and play it. Then take your time to look at the next beat and then move directly and confidently to that next hand position if necessary and play that and listen to the sound. So you're really just taking your time. We call that blue mode because it's compared to kind of traditional sight reading where you just dive in and that's kind of overwhelming for a lot of people. This is pretty tranquil, and relaxed and peaceful. And the brain learns really well when it gets into that kind of zone, and you can do it with any sheet music.
Right. And I also want to squash a myth about sight reading that I think gets in the way of a lot of people, and that is the literal definition of sight reading, would suggest that it's only sight reading if you've never played the piece before. But I've always thought of sight reading as a phase. You can apply it to anything you haven't learned really well. Like it might be you have the music in front of you and it's more of a prompt, instead of pure memorization. But if you haven't reached that point, if you feel like I don't really know this music, you're still sight reading. So I would say the same is true for anything that you worked on to a point. And I mean, let's just say that, you're an adult now and you worked on a certain method book back when you were 11 or 12 years old. Chances are you don't remember most of those pieces. Those are very good for going back to for focusing on the elements of sight reading.
Yes, totally. And, I think that's part of, I always go back to myself as a teenager when I avoided practicing sight reading. And I think part of the reason was because I thought that the only real way that, true musicians practice sight reading is to just take something you've never seen before and then go full speed. Mm-hmm. And what you're describing is, hey, take a piece that you've seen it before, you've played through it a little bit maybe, and you're kind of familiar with it. Use that, with that blue mode practice, because that can really boost confidence and keep people motivated, especially if you're playing one of your favorite songs. As long as you haven't, worked on it really hard and you haven't memorized it, so to speak, you're still actually reading the notes. Those are great. Those are a lot of fun to do blue mode with as well.
All right. Well, this is something we could certainly talk about for quite a while, but I appreciate definitely the hands-on, literally hands-on approach of learning sight reading. We talked about your course, your website, sightreadingspark.com, and your Facebook group, the Piano Sight Reading Community. Is there anything else you'd like to share about where people can get in touch with you or follow you?
Those are the two main ones. And I'll say that with the Piano Sight Reading Community, I'm planning to start putting in some more videos, on these sorts of tips. But there are also a lot of really sharp teachers in that group that share things.
All right. Well, David, it's been great having you chat with me today about this. So thank you so much for being a guest.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, David.
And that's going to wrap up episode number 62. I forgot to mention in advance that there were some internet buffering issues with our when we recorded this conversation, so I apologize for that. I hope that was not too distracting. I thought as I was listening to it, all of the points came across very clearly, and again, I really enjoyed my conversation with David. And I encourage you to check out his sight reading course and also his Facebook group. Those links will be in the show notes. It's been a while since I've asked this, but if you haven't already left a 5-star rating and review on wherever you get your podcasts, and specifically if you listen on Apple Podcasts, where this is very helpful, I would appreciate it if you would be willing to do that. And regardless whether you've done it or not, or whether you feel like going that far, it would be very helpful if you would share this episode with at least one other person. Certainly you probably know a musician who would like to do better at sight reading, and something in this episode might be informative or inspirational. Well, again, that's going to wrap up episode number 62. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with you again next week.